Fog rolled off the coast the way it always did before dawn, thick and low, turning the shoreline into something half-remembered. The kind of morning where sound travels wrong, where footsteps carry further than they should, where the world feels like it is holding its breath. He had made many mistakes, but none compared to the one that brought him here. The most feared name in 4 territories stood at the end of a gravel path that did not appear on any map he had ever controlled. His shoes were wrong for this ground. His coat was wrong for this wind. Everything about him belonged to a different world, one built on marble floors and closed doors and voices that never needed to rise because the silence around them was already loud enough. Here, there was nothing but the ocean pulling itself against the rocks, and a cottage sitting low against the hillside like it had grown there on its own. He had not slept. The drive had taken 7 hours, and he had stopped once, only because his hands had started shaking on the wheel and he could not afford to crash before he reached her. Before he saw for himself whether the photograph was real, or whether 3 years of searching had finally broken something inside him that could not be repaired. Light moved behind the cottage window. Faint, warm, the kind that comes from a kitchen where someone is already awake, already moving through a routine that does not include him. He heard a cabinet close, water running, a voice, low and steady, speaking to someone too quietly for the words to carry. Then a second voice, smaller, higher, a child. His breath stopped. He stepped closer. 3 years of silence, of dead ends, of rooms that still carried the shape of her absence. 3 years of hearing 9 words play over and over in his mind, words that had cost him everything. The door opened before he could reach it. She stood there the way she had always stood in doorways, straight, composed, like the frame existed to hold her and not the other way around. But everything else was different. Her hair was shorter, pulled back, her face sharper, older, stripped of the softness he remembered. No jewelry, no silk, and no trace of the world she had once moved through like it had been designed for her. She wore a gray sweater with sleeves pushed past her wrists, and there was flour on her hands. Flour. On the hands that used to rest against his chest at the end of long nights, while he told her things he had never said out loud to anyone. His throat closed. And then the boy appeared. He came around her leg slowly, one hand gripping the fabric of her sweater, the other holding a small wooden horse with the paint half worn away. He was small, 2, nearly 3, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that made something inside Dragan fracture before he could stop it. Because the boy's face was his face, not similar, not an echo, his. The same jaw that would sharpen with age, the same deep-set eyes that missed nothing, the same tilt of the head, slight, assessing, like the world was a problem being solved in real time. The child looked up at him without fear, without recognition, without anything except the open curiosity of someone who had never been given a reason to be afraid of strangers. "Mama." The boy tugged her sweater once. "Who is he?" Dragan felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically, somewhere deeper, somewhere that had everything to do with the fact that his son had just called him a stranger. Mara did not move, but something behind her eyes locked into place, something cold and practiced, something that had been waiting for this moment the way a person waits for a storm they always knew would come. "Go inside, Emmerich," she said, completely calm, like the man standing 6 feet from her door had not just walked out of a life she had buried 3 years ago. The boy hesitated. His eyes moved from her face to Dragan's, then back again, measuring something he was too young to name, but old enough to feel. "Now," she said, softer, but final. He went. The sound of his small footsteps disappearing into the cottage was the loudest thing Dragan had ever heard. They stood in the silence that followed, the fog pressing in around them, the ocean filling the space between words that neither of them could find. Marit. The name came out broken, raw, nothing like the voice that made grown men lower their eyes. You found the wrong house, she said. I found you. Then you wasted your time. The door closed. Not slammed, closed. Deliberately, steadily, like she had practiced the motion 1,000 times in her head. The latch clicked, small and absolute. And the only two people he had left in the world were on the other side of a door that no longer belonged to him. He stood there. The fog thickened. The cold settled into his coat, his skin, his bones. He lowered himself onto the stone step outside her door, rested his forearms on his knees, and stayed. Because somewhere behind that door, a boy with his face was learning to live without him. And somewhere behind those steady eyes, the woman he had lost was carrying a wound that he had put there with 9 words he never meant her to hear. Inside the cottage, Emmerich's voice drifted through the walls, small and certain. Mama, why is the man sitting outside? Silence. Then Marette's voice, quieter, tighter, threaded with something she would never let her son see, because he doesn't know where he belongs anymore. And outside, in the fog, the man who had once decided the fate of cities pressed his palms together and realized that for the first time in his life, she was right. The life I had before that night still visits me sometimes, not as a memory, as a haunting. It comes in fragments, the sound of low music echoing through rooms too large for any family to fill. The way candlelight moved across stone walls during dinners that lasted for hours, where I sat beside him and believed, truly believed, that the most dangerous man I had ever known would never be dangerous to me. That was the life I built my trust on. That was the life that made me foolish enough to love without conditions. I was not born into his world. I came from a quieter place, a smaller life, one where people said what they meant, and the worst betrayal you could imagine was a broken promise, not a broken body. When Dragan found me, or when I found him, depending on which version of the story you believe, I understood the weight, the silence that followed him into rooms, the way people stepped aside without being asked. But I never understood what it cost, or who paid for it. He never let me see that part. He kept it sealed behind doors I was never invited to open, handled by men whose names I was never told. What I saw instead was the other side. The quiet mornings when he would sit across from me and listen like nothing outside that room existed. The way his hand would find the back of my neck when he thought I was falling asleep. Gentle in a way that contradicted everything his reputation demanded. I believed I was the exception. The one person his world could not reach. The one thing no enemy could take because he would never allow it. I was wrong. Not because his enemies took me, because his own words did. And the worst part, the part I still cannot look at directly even now, is that I do not think he knows what he did. I think he said those 9 words the way he said everything, with precision, with control, with absolute certainty that the consequences would land exactly where he intended. They didn't. They landed on me, and I have been carrying them ever since. The night it happened began like every other night in that house. People arrived, voices filled the lower halls, and the estate transformed itself into the version of our life that was meant to be seen. Controlled, elegant, untouchable. I had not been invited to this meeting. That was not unusual. There were rooms I never entered, conversations I never heard, decisions I was never asked to weigh in on. I had accepted that a long time ago, not because I agreed with it, but because the alternative was a fight I did not have the tools to win. I had been upstairs, reading, waiting for the noise to fade so the house could feel like ours again. But it went on longer than usual. The voices were different, harder, less polished than the ones that usually filled our home. Something about the rhythm of it unsettled me, not loud enough to be an argument, but too tense to be negotiation. I should have stayed where I was. That is the thought I come back to most often. But something pulled me toward the staircase, something I could not name, and I followed it the way you follow a sound in the dark. Not because you want to find it, but because the not knowing is worse. The corridor outside his study was empty. Everyone who mattered was inside. I could hear them through the door, voices layered over each other, careful, deliberate. His voice moved through them all, lower, steadier, the anchor around which everything else orbited. I was simply there, in the wrong place at the wrong time. His voice came through the door, clear, composed, unshakable. My wife was never the love of my life. 9 words. That was all it took. 9 words spoken in a voice I had trusted more than my own, delivered with the kind of certainty that left no room for interpretation. I did not hear what came after. I do not know if anyone responded. I do not know if the room shifted, or if silence followed the way it should have followed something that final. Because the moment those words reached me, everything inside my body shut down at once. Sound collapsed. The hallway stretched and narrowed at the same time. My hands went numb against my sides. The sentence replayed itself, once, twice, 3 times, each repetition cutting deeper because each time my mind tried to find a different meaning and failed. My wife was never the love of my life, not whispered in anger, not spoken where words come out wrong and get taken back by morning. This was measured, deliberate. My hand was still raised near the door. I lowered it without making a sound. I never confronted him, never pushed the door open to demand an explanation, never cried or screamed or did any of the things a woman is supposed to do when she discovers that the life she built her entire existence around was never what she believed it to be. Instead, I stepped back. 1 step, then another, then another. Each one carrying me further from the man I had loved and closer to someone I did not yet recognize. The hallway was long. My footsteps were silent. No one saw me leave because no one had known I was there. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, the decision had already been made. Not consciously, not with logic, not with anything that could be reasoned with or talked out of. He had given me his answer. He had given it in his own voice, in his own words, in his own house. And I believed him. That was the night the woman he married disappeared. Not from the estate, not yet. That would come later. But from the place inside herself where she had once kept every gentle thing he had ever given her, every quiet morning, every careful touch, every time he had made her believe she was the exception. She closed that place like a door, and she did not look back. I did not pack while crying. I want to be honest about that because it matters. There were no tears, no trembling hands, no dramatic last look around a room filled with memories. There was only movement, efficient, quiet, and stripped of everything that might slow me down. The suite I used was not the main bedroom. It was the smaller room at the far end of the hall, the one with the reading chair and the narrow closet where I kept things that had nothing to do with his world, a coat that was mine before I met him, a pair of shoes meant for walking, not for standing beside someone, a bag I had never unpacked because some part of me had always known I might need to leave faster than I arrived. I took cash. Not much, but enough. I had been keeping it in an envelope tucked inside a book he would never open. Not because I had planned this, but because women who live inside someone else's power learn to build small safeties without knowing why. I took my identification, the real one, not the name his world had given me. And I took nothing else. Every piece of jewelry stayed where it sat. Every dress remained on its hanger. Because taking any of it would have meant I still wanted to belong to him. The estate had a rhythm at night. I had memorized it without meaning to. Security changed positions at 15-minute intervals. The east garden gate was monitored by camera, but the stone wall along the south terrace had a section where the ivy grew thick enough to hide a shadow, and the motion sensor had been broken for 2 weeks. No enemy would approach from there. But I was not an enemy. I was something far more dangerous. I was someone who had been paying attention. The wall was not high. The ground on the other side was soft, damp from an earlier rain, and it caught my landing without sound. I stood in the darkness beyond his property line and breathed air that tasted different already. Not better, not worse, just unclaimed. I walked, not toward anything, just away, toward the unlit stretch where the land opened into something rural and unmapped. Every second without pursuit made the next one feel possible. I reached the regional bus depot before sunrise, a small concrete building with fluorescent lighting that buzzed too loud, and a ticket counter staffed by a woman who never looked up. I bought a ticket to the furthest destination on the board. I only cared that it was far. The bus was nearly empty. I sat in the back row, pressed against the window, watching the landscape change from city to farmland to coastline in a slow blur that felt less like travel and more like erasure. I should have felt grief, but grief requires belief that what you lost was real, and I was no longer sure it had been. His voice played in my head on a loop I could not stop. My wife was never the love of my life. 9 words. Steady, certain, spoken without hesitation. I pressed my forehead against the glass and watched the world disappear behind me. Somewhere inside an estate built to contain everything he owned, a man who controlled the fates of thousands had not yet realized that the one person who mattered had already gone. By the time he did, I would be no one. The bus stopped 14 times before I got off. Not because the 14th stop was special, but because when the doors opened and the salt air hit me, something inside my chest loosened for the first time in days, like a fist unclenching, like a breath I had been holding since that hallway. The town had no sign at the bus stop. I had to walk before I saw one, weathered wood with faded letters that read, Carden Cove. Population not listed. No reason for anyone to come here. No reason for anyone to look. It sat against the coast like something the ocean had forgotten to wash away. A harbor with boats that looked older than the buildings. A single road that curved along the waterline before climbing a low hill and ending at a church no one seemed to attend. I stood at the edge of it and waited for the feeling of danger that had been following me since I left. It never came. This place existed so far outside the world I had run from that the two could not occupy the same thought. The inn was halfway down the main road, a stone building with green shutters and a chimney that leaned slightly to the left like it had been arguing with the wind for decades. The sign above the door read, Halloran's, and beneath it, rooms and meals. The woman who opened the door was not what I expected. Tall, angular, her silver hair cut short in a way that suggested efficiency rather than style. Her eyes moved over me the way the ocean moves over rocks, steady, unhurried, missing nothing. "You're not a tourist," she said. "No." "Running from something?" I hesitated. She didn't. "I don't need to know what. I need to know if it's going to follow you through my door." "It won't," I told her. And in that moment, I believed it. Her name was Neve. She had run Halloran's alone since her husband died at sea 11 years earlier. She needed help with the morning meals, the rooms, the endless small tasks that kept a place alive when the world had no reason to notice it. She offered me work, a room on the top floor with a window that faced the water, and a single condition. "Don't lie to me. About anything else, I don't care. But if you lie to me, you leave." I nodded, and I meant it. Because I had spent years living inside someone else's lies, I was not going to build my next life on lies of my own. The room was small. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, A mirror I turned to face the wall, because I was not ready to look at the woman I was becoming, but it was mine. The door locked from the inside, and for the first time in longer than I could measure, no one on the other side of it had the power to decide whether I stayed or went. I slept that night. Not well, not deeply, but I slept. And when I woke before dawn to the sound of gulls and the distant pull of the tide, I went downstairs and began the work of disappearing. 6 weeks passed before my body told me what my mind had been refusing to hear. The nausea came first, arriving without warning while I was folding sheets in the upstairs hallway. It hit so fast I had to press my hand against the wall and wait for the floor to stop shifting. I told myself it was the fish from last night's meal. Then it happened again, the next morning, and the next. I ignored it the way I had learned to ignore everything that threatened to pull me backward, but Neve noticed. She noticed everything. She said nothing for 3 days. Just watched me with that quiet assessment I had come to understand was not judgment, but calculation. On the 4th morning, when I gripped the kitchen counter against a wave of dizziness, she set a cup of tea in front of me and sat down. "How far along?" she asked, like she was asking about the weather. The question hit me harder than the nausea. I opened my mouth to deny it, to reshape it into something I could manage. But I had promised her I would not lie. "I don't know," I said. "Then you should find out." The clinic in Carden Cove was one room attached to the back of the pharmacy, staffed by a nurse named Britta, who divided her time between this town and 2 others along the coast. 8 weeks. Maybe 9. Healthy so far. I walked out into the gray coastal light and stood on the sidewalk while the truth rearranged everything I had built since I arrived. Every plan, every layer of anonymity, every quiet morning where I had begun to believe I might actually survive this, all of it shifted under a new weight. I was carrying his child, the man whose voice still played in my head at night, whose words had told a room full of people I never mattered. No amount of distance could change the fact that I was still connected to him in the most permanent way possible. I wanted to be angry. I reached for it. That clean, sharp fury that had carried me out of his estate and into a life that did not include him. But it would not come. Instead, something quieter arrived. The realization that I was going to love this child regardless. Not because of him, not in spite of him, but completely separate from him. The way a river meets the sea without caring where the water came from. The months that followed moved slowly. Neve said little about it. She made room without being asked, adjusted my tasks without discussion, left small things on the counter that I needed before I knew I needed them. Ginger for the nausea. Extra blankets when the cold settled into my bones. A book on my nightstand with no explanation. I never asked her why. I think she understood loss well enough to recognize when someone needed help without the burden of having to ask for it. The birth came on a night so still it felt like the world had simply stopped turning. No wind, no rain, no sound, except the slow rhythm of the tide against the harbor walls. Britta arrived within the hour. Neve stayed in the hallway, close enough to hear, far enough to give me space. I labored in the small upstairs room, gripping the iron bed frame until my knuckles went white, biting down on every sound because even here, some part of me was afraid that if I screamed, someone might hear. And then, he arrived. Not loudly, quietly, almost carefully, like he was testing the air before deciding whether this place was safe enough to stay. They placed him on my chest, and I looked down at a face that broke something inside me I did not know was still intact. He was Dragan, not a shadow, not a resemblance. The exact reproduction of the man I had run from, rebuilt in miniature, placed against my skin like the universe had decided that no matter how far I went, I would never be allowed to forget. The same brow, the same set of the mouth, the same impossible stillness in the eyes, dark and deep, and already watching the world like it owed him an explanation. I held him and I cried. Not for myself, not for what I had lost, but for the unbearable cruelty of loving something this completely while knowing that every time I looked at his face, I would see the man who had told a room full of strangers that I meant nothing. I named him Emmerich. It meant nothing to anyone else. It did not need to. It was his. It was new. The first thing in his life that had no connection to the world I had left behind. Neve came in after Britta left. She looked at the baby, then at me, and whatever she saw made her sit down on the edge of the bed without a word. She stayed until I fell asleep, one hand resting near mine, not touching, just present. When I woke, it was morning. Emmerich was still against my chest, breathing in the slow, measured way of someone who had already decided the world was an acceptable place to be. I watched him for a long time, and somewhere in that silence, the fear settled into its permanent shape. Because if Dragan ever found us, he would not see a child. He would see a continuation, a legacy, something that belonged to his bloodline and therefore belonged to him. He would not ask. Men like him never asked. And I would never let him take what I had built from nothing. He never noticed she was gone until morning. That was the detail that destroyed him most, not the absence itself, but the hours it had existed before he felt it. The meeting had ended late. He had gone to their room expecting to find her asleep, expecting the familiar shape of her beneath the sheets, the way her hand always rested palm up on the pillow beside her, like she was waiting for him even in sleep. The bed was made. Not slept in. Made. He moved through the room the way only a man trained in reading absences could. The closet, untouched, except for the things that had been hers before him. Gone. The small bag beneath her reading chair. Gone. The envelope inside the book on the third shelf. The one he had always known about and never mentioned because he understood that a woman who keeps an exit does so because she has learned to need one. Gone. His chest went cold. He pulled the security footage himself, alone in the monitoring room. He saw her walk through the south garden at 12 minutes past 1 in the morning. No hesitation, no looking back. She moved like someone who had already left hours before her body followed. The search began within the hour, but it could not be loud. The meeting from that night had been about containment, about a threat that had circled his operation for months, a rival network that had identified the one vulnerability no one believed he possessed. Her. They had been watching, gathering intelligence, building a case for leverage that would force his hand. And he had done the only thing he could to remove her from their crosshairs. He had lied. He had sat in that room with men who would have used her as a bargaining chip and told them she meant nothing, a formality, an arrangement without weight. He had watched the calculation behind their eyes recalibrate, the threat dissolving because a man who does not love his wife cannot be hurt through her. It had worked. The threat withdrew. She was safe. And she had vanished. It took 9 days before he reviewed the hallway footage. 9 days before he saw her standing outside his study, still as stone, one hand raised near the door. 9 days before the timestamp aligned with the exact moment his voice had carried through the wood. The realization arrived like a detonation in a sealed room, nowhere to go, no way to absorb the force. She had heard him. She had heard the worst 5 seconds of a performance designed to save her life, and she had believed them so completely that she had erased herself from his world without giving him a chance to explain. He sat in that monitoring room for a long time after the footage ended. The screen went black, and he did not move. Because the cruelest part was not that she had left. It was that his lie had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had made her safe. And it had cost him everything. The threat had been real, not exaggerated, not theoretical, not the kind of danger that men in his world invented to justify the things they did. It had been immediate, specific, and aimed at the one person he had spent years keeping invisible. Her name had appeared in an intercepted communication 4 months before that night. Not her full name, not her location, but enough to confirm that someone outside his network had been building a file. Photographs taken from a distance, notes on her schedule, details about the routes she took, the mornings she walked alone through the garden before anyone else in the estate was awake. He had not told her. That was the decision he would carry the longest. Because telling her meant involving her, and involving her meant making her a participant in a world he had sworn would never touch her. He had promised that the day he married her, not in words, but in the architecture of their life together, she lived above the operation, insulated, protected, surrounded by walls designed to keep everything dangerous on the other side. Those walls had failed, not because of force, but because of patience. A rival family had spent months threading into his operation at the lowest levels. They had not come for territory or profit. They had come for influence. And the fastest way to influence a man who could not be bought or outmaneuvered was to take the only thing he could not replace. The night of the meeting was supposed to end it. He had invited them deliberately, a calculated display of control meant to deliver a single message: that she was not worth taking. My wife was never the love of my life. He had rehearsed not the words, but the delivery, the steadiness, the indifference, the careful absence of emotion. He needed them to leave believing that hurting her would produce nothing. It had worked. Within 2 weeks, the surveillance ended. The rival family redirected their attention toward other targets, other men whose attachments were easier to exploit. He had won. She was safe. And she was gone. The months that followed turned him into something he did not recognize. Not outwardly. Outwardly, the empire continued. Meetings were held, decisions were made. But underneath, where his mind used to operate with clarity, there was only static. Her face, her absence, the hallway footage replaying on a loop that no amount of discipline could stop. He dismantled the rival family slowly, not because they still posed a threat, but because they were the reason he had been forced to speak those words. He removed them the way he removed everything that interfered with what he valued, thoroughly, permanently, without leaving enough behind for anyone to rebuild. But vengeance did not return what he had lost. It never does. It simply clears the ground where something used to stand and forces you to look at the empty space. The search continued, no longer constrained by the need to hide her value. He could look freely. Every resource, every connection, every system at his disposal. And still she remained invisible. 3 years of tracing leads that collapsed into nothing. Border records, transport databases, hospital admissions, employment rosters. 3 years of waking in a room that still held the faint trace of her, and knowing that wherever she was, she believed she had been married to a man who never loved her. That thought was the one he could not outrun. Not because it was true, but because she believed it was. And belief, once it takes root in someone strong enough to act on it, becomes indistinguishable from truth. He had made her disappear, not with violence, not with force, but with 9 words delivered in the wrong voice to the right ears, heard by the one person who should never have been listening. It came through none of the systems he had rebuilt, none of the contacts placed to track people who never wanted to be found. It came through a fisherman, a man named Coyle, 63 years old, a supplier who ran cold chain shipments between coastal towns. Coyle had no connection to Dragon's world. He had never heard the name, never had reason to know that the woman he passed every Tuesday morning at the harbor in Carden Cove was someone an entire organization had spent 3 years trying to locate. But Coyle had a nephew, and the nephew had a debt. And the debt had been purchased by a man who worked for a man who reported to someone in Dragon's outer network. These are the chains that invisible women are eventually found through. Not because the system is designed to catch them, but because the world is smaller than anyone who runs from it wants to believe. The nephew mentioned the town in passing. A coastal place, quiet. The kind where people go when they do not want to be somewhere else. A woman worked at the inn there, dark-haired, kept to herself, and had a boy who looked like he belonged to someone important. That last detail. A boy who looked like he belonged to someone important. It moved through 3 intermediaries before it reached a man who understood what it might mean. One phone call. 40 minutes later, the information was on Dragan's desk. No photograph, no confirmation, just a location, a description, and a detail about a child that should not have existed in a town that should not have mattered. His reaction was not what anyone expected. No command, no deployment of resources that had been standing ready for 3 years. He read the message once, then again, then folded the paper along its center crease with a precision that made the room go very quiet. "Where?" he asked. "Carden Cove, southern coast. 7 hours by car." He stood. No one else moved. The air compressed the way it always did when he made a decision that carried finality. He drove himself. Through the city, then the sprawl where concrete turned to farmland, then further, along coastal roads that narrowed until the ocean appeared on his left, like something that had been waiting for him to arrive. Carden Cove looked like nothing. A scattering of buildings pressed against a hillside, a harbor that held more history than ambition. He understood immediately why she had chosen it. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was invisible. He parked before dawn. For a moment he sat with his hands on the wheel, breathing in a way that felt unfamiliar, shallow, and careful. A boy. There was a boy. The mathematics were not complicated. 3 years since she vanished. A child old enough to walk, to speak, to look like someone. The timing left no room for alternatives, and yet his mind kept reaching for them. Because accepting this meant she had not just left, she had built an entire life without him, carried and raised a child he never knew existed, his child. He found the cottage before the sun cleared the hillside. He walked to the door the way a man walks towards something he is not sure he deserves to reach. The fog wrapped around him. And when the door opened, when she stood there with flour on her hands and a boy pressed against her leg, when the child looked up at him with a face that was his own, returned in a form he had never imagined, every word he had prepared collapsed under a weight no amount of control could support. She saw him. She understood. And the door closed between them with a sound that was quieter than anything that had ever hurt him this much. He sat on the step. The fog thickened. And he stayed. Because behind that door was proof that the lie he had told to protect her had also created something he had not protected at all. And that failure was not something he could walk away from. The town did not know what to make of him. That was clear from the way people moved past the cottage during those first hours, their steps slowing just enough to register his presence without acknowledging it directly. A man in a dark coat, sitting on a stone step in the fog, not moving, not speaking. He stayed through the morning. The fog burned off around 9, replaced by a thin gray light. Fishing boats came and went. A dog trotted past without stopping. The mailman paused at the end of the path, glanced once, and left the letters in the box by the gate. Inside, Marit could feel his presence the way a structure feels a storm that has not yet made landfall. Something atmospheric. Something her body recognized before her mind could override it. Emmerich sat at the kitchen table drawing with crayons. His grip on them was precise for a child his age. Deliberate. Like the world was a series of problems that could be solved if you paid close enough attention. He had not mentioned the man at the door again, but twice she caught him glancing toward the window. Neve arrived at 10:30, carrying bread and eggs and whatever quiet observations she had gathered on the walkover. She set the groceries on the counter, looked at Moret, then looked toward the front of the cottage. "He's still there," Moret said before she could ask. Neve placed eggs in the bowl by the stove one at a time, unhurried. "He's the boy's father." The silence that followed was answer enough. By afternoon, the town's curiosity had shifted into something more active. Corrigan, the pub owner, walked past twice on errands he clearly did not have. Fenella from the post office made 4 passes along the gravel road. It was Emmerich who broke the pattern. He stood at the window sometime around 3, chin barely reaching the sill, watching the man with the same focused stillness that made him look years older than he was. "What's he doing?" Emmerich asked. "Sitting." "Why?" "I don't know." The lie tasted wrong. She knew exactly why he was sitting there, and the reason terrified her more than anything he could have done with force. He was there because he had nowhere else to go. Not geographically, but fundamentally. Instead of commanding or taking or reshaping the situation into something he could control, he was simply present. That was not the man she had married. That was not the man she had run from. And that difference was more unsettling than his arrival had been. "He looks cold," Emmerich said quietly. Marit closed her eyes. When she opened them, her son was still at the window, his small hand pressed flat against the glass, like he was measuring the distance between himself and the stranger who shared his face. Evening came slowly. Maret put Emmerich to bed at 7. He went without resistance but asked one question before she turned off the light. "Is he going to be there tomorrow?" She paused in the doorway. "I don't know, baby." "I think he will," he said. Then he turned onto his side and closed his eyes, and the certainty in his voice made her grip the doorframe harder than she meant to. She stepped onto the porch at 8:15. He was still there. His coat was damp, his hair pressed flat, and he looked like a man who had stopped caring about his own body hours ago. She stood behind him, arms crossed, the door at her back. "You can't stay here," she said. "I know." "Then leave." He was quiet for a long time, long enough for the harbor bell to chime once in the distance. "I will leave if you tell me one thing," he said finally. His voice was rough, worn thin by hours of silence, and the particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. "When you left that night, what did you hear?" The question landed somewhere she was not ready for, not because it was unexpected, but because it assumed something she had not considered, that there was something she might have missed. She stepped back inside and closed the door. But this time, she did not lock it, and he heard the difference. She did not sleep that night. The question sat in the dark beside her, breathing, waiting, and refusing to dissolve. "When you left that night, what did you hear?" It implied a gap, a space between what she heard and what was said. A difference she had never allowed herself to consider, because considering it would mean the foundation she had built her entire survival on might be flawed. And if it was, then everything above it, the escape, the silence, the years of raising Emmerich alone, all of it was built on a misunderstanding she could have corrected if she had stayed long enough to listen. She rejected that thought 3 times before dawn, but it kept returning. He was not on the step when she opened the door the next morning. For one disorienting second, relief and disappointment collided in her chest. Then she saw him. Across the road, sitting on the low stone wall that separated the coastal path from the hillside. Far enough to give her space. Close enough to be seen. He had moved. But he had not left. 2 more days passed. He found a room at Halloran's. He did not approach the cottage again. He simply existed within her radius, visible but not insistent, present but not demanding. It was the absence of demand that undid her. On the 3rd evening, she found him on the coastal path, watching the water. Emmerich was with Neve. The town was quiet, and for the first time since he arrived, she walked toward him instead of away. He turned when he heard her steps, and the expression on his face was not what she expected. Not relief, not triumph. It was fear. Real, unconcealed. The kind she had never seen on him. The kind that told her whatever he was about to say was something he had been carrying for longer than she could imagine. Say it, she told him. Whatever you came here to say it now. He exhaled slowly. That night, in the study, there were men in the room who had spent 4 months planning to take you. Take me, she repeated, flat, testing. Kidnap you, use you, force my hand by threatening the one person I could not afford to lose. I had intelligence, names, and timelines. They were going to move on you within the month. Her arms tightened across her chest, and your solution was to tell them I meant nothing. My solution was to make them believe that hurting you would gain them nothing, that I would not respond if they took you because you were never worth responding for. The words hit the same place they had hit 3 years ago, but this time the angle was different. This time they came wrapped in something she had not heard before. Context. My wife was never the love of my life, she said, and even now, the words still cut. I heard you say it, through the door, in your voice. Yes. And you expect me to believe it was a performance. I expect you to believe what you need to believe. But I am telling you what happened. I sat in that room and said the worst thing I have ever said in my life because the alternative was watching them take you. She shook her head, not in denial, but in the anguish that comes from two truths existing in the same space. You could have told me. Before, after, any moment in between. I know. Then why didn't you? The silence that followed was the heaviest thing between them. Heavier than the years, heavier than the distance. Because I thought I was protecting you, he said, and something in his voice cracked. I thought if you didn't know, it couldn't touch you. I thought the less you were involved, the safer you would be. And I was wrong about all of it. I spent 3 years believing you never loved me, she said. The words came out quieter than she intended, carrying every night in that small room above the harbor. Every morning she had looked at Emmerich's face and seen the man who had discarded her. I know, he said. And I spent 3 years knowing you believed that because of something I chose to say. Not something that was done to me. Something I did. Deliberately. With my own voice. The distinction landed hard. In the story she had built, he was careless. Cruel, maybe. But this was a man who had chosen to wound her in order to shield her, and had miscalculated so catastrophically that the wound became the only truth she had. The men in that room, she said, steadier now. What happened to them? Gone. All of them. The operation, the family, every person who had your name in a file. Gone. Something shifted in her expression, not forgiveness, the faintest recalibration. Emmerich, she said. His jaw tightened at the name. She saw it, the way the sound of his son's name moved through him like a current he could not control. He has your face, she said. Every single morning I wake up, and the first thing I see is you looking back at me from a child who has never heard your name. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Not tears, not yet, but the closest thing to them a man like him would ever allow. I didn't know. About him. About any of it. And that, she said, her voice catching, is exactly what I was afraid of. The silence returned, but it was different now. Thinner. Less like a wall, and more like a membrane that could be crossed if either of them chose to. Neither did. Not yet. But when she turned to walk back, she did not tell him to leave. And he did not ask if he could follow. It did not happen all at once. Forgiveness never does. Not the real kind. It moves in fractions, in shifts you only recognize afterward, when you look back and realize the distance has been closing so gradually you cannot identify the moment it began. He stayed in Carden Cove, not at her door, but within the quiet perimeter of her life. He rented the room at Halloran's by the week, then by the month. Whatever empire continued in his absence existed on the other side of a line he refused to cross. Emmerich was the one who decided first. Children do that. They lack the architecture adults build to keep people at a distance. They simply respond to what they feel. It started with proximity. The boy would appear near Dragan without explanation, watching him with that focused attention that made people forget he was not yet 3. He never spoke first. He simply positioned himself within reach and waited. Dragan never pushed. He simply acknowledged his presence. A look, a nod, a stillness that matched the child's own. The first word Emmerich spoke to him directly was on a Tuesday. Dragan was sitting on the stone wall near the harbor, and Emmerich had wandered close while Neve watched from a distance. "What's your name?" the boy asked, as though the answer would determine something important. "Dragan." Emmerich considered this for several seconds, testing the word's weight, its shape, its place in the world he was still assembling. "That's a strong name," he said. Then he sat beside him, close enough that their arms almost touched, and looked out at the water. Marette heard about it from Neve that evening. She did not react outwardly, but something behind her ribs shifted in a way that felt less like breaking and more like settling. The storm came 3 weeks later, the kind that arrives without warning, the sky darkening in minutes, the wind turning hostile, the ocean slamming against the harbor wall hard enough to rattle windows. Marit was at the inn helping Neve secure the shutters. Emmerich was at the cottage, asleep. The walk between the two was 4 minutes in calm weather. In the storm, it was longer. By the time she reached the front path, the wind forced her to brace against it with every step. The door was open, not wide, just enough for light to spill into the rain. Her heart lurched. She found them in the kitchen. Emmerich was in Dragan's arms, his face pressed into the collar of a coat that smelled like salt and distance, his small body still gripped by the aftershock of whatever had frightened him in the dark. Dragan was on the floor, his back against the cabinet, one hand on the boy's head, the other wrapped around his body with a steadiness that made everything else feel peripheral. The door had been unlocked, the one she had stopped locking 2 weeks ago without admitting to herself why. Emmerich had woken to the storm, frightened in the dark, and opened the front door looking for her. Dragan had been crossing from Halloran's when he saw the small figure in the doorway, lit by lightning, barefoot, calling for someone who was not there. He had reached him before the next crack of thunder. Marit stood watching a man she had spent 3 years running from hold her son the way she had always imagined a father should. Not with ownership, not with the weight of legacy or possession. With care, simple, unperformative, instinctive. The kind that has no audience and therefore no motive beyond itself. Emmerich's breathing was slow. His grip on Dragan's collar had loosened into something that looked less like fear and more like trust. And when he opened his eyes and saw her, he did not reach for her the way he usually did. He stayed where he was. And in that choice, something inside her gave way that she could no longer rebuild. Later, after Emmerich was asleep, and the storm had begun to pull apart over the ocean, she found Dragan in the kitchen, his coat still wet, his face carrying something she had never seen on him before. Not control, not composure. Something open, something unfinished. "I can't keep doing this," she said, and her voice was softer than it had been in years. "I can't keep standing on one side of a wall pretending it doesn't matter that you're on the other." He waited, the way he had been waiting since the first morning on the step. "I don't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. You made a choice without me, and it cost me 3 years and every certainty I had." "I know. But I understand why you did it. And I understand that he needs more than what I can give him alone." She stopped, breathed. Let the silence hold what words couldn't. I don't know what this becomes. I don't know how to rebuild something when I'm still not sure what it was. Then we don't rebuild it, he said quietly. We build something different. Something that starts here. The simplicity of it moved through her the way warmth moves through cold hands, slowly, painfully, but undeniably real. She closed the space between them. Not all of it, but enough. His hand reached for hers. Slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. They stood like that for a long time. The storm faded. The harbor settled. And somewhere upstairs, a boy with his father's face slept without fear for the first time since the thunder began. There was no ceremony, not the kind the world expects. There was a morning, 3 months later, where the fog lifted early and the sky above Carden Cove turned the kind of blue that feels like permission. Neve made breakfast. Emmerich wore a shirt he had chosen himself, the one with small boats printed on the fabric, because he said it looked like the harbor. They walked to the coastal path, the three of them, and stood where the stone wall meets the cliff edge and the ocean opens into something too large to belong to anyone. Dragan spoke first. Not promises, not vows. He spoke to her the way he should have spoken 3 years ago, openly, without strategy, without the reflex of protection that had cost them everything. And when she answered, it was not because she had forgotten. It was because she had decided that the truth of what they were now mattered more than the lie that had separated them. Emmerich stood between them, one hand in each of theirs, looking out at the water with the focused calm that had always made him seem older than his years. He understood enough. He understood that the man with the strong name was staying. He understood that his mother's shoulders had finally lowered. He understood that the house would be different now, not louder, not larger, and just fuller. And in the end, that was all any of it had ever been about. Not power, not pride, not the empires that men build and tear apart trying to hold on to things they never learned how to simply ask for. Just a door that stayed open, and someone on the other side who chose to walk through it.